conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Today we are discussing one of the biggest stories to come out of the Middle East over the past 5 years, which is the rise of Mohammed bin Salman. The Saudi crown prince has dominated headlines over the last 5 years, at times for bloody and gruesome reasons, for the way he has consolidated power in almost Ataturkian-like way in his grand reform for the country. And of course, for the blockade of Qatar and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. To discuss the issues and make better sense of what is unfolding in Saudi Arabia, I'm delighted to be joined by Justin Scheck, who is the co-author of Blood and Oil, Mohammed bin Salman's ruthless quest for global power. Justin, he has worked at the Wall Street Journal since 2007, first in San Francisco and later in London and New York. He covers Silicon Valley tech companies, white-collar crime, blue-collar crime, mining and oil companies, and currently works on international financial investigations. He has been writing about Saudi Arabia since 2016. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us, Justin.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Your book could not be more timely. Congratulations, I guess, on completing it, and also, I guess, a testament to your foresight on how important MBS was going to turn out to be. I guess the question I want to ask you first is what sparked your interest initially to write a book on MBS?
So my co-author and I, Bradley Hope, were working together in London for the Wall Street Journal. And, I've been writing about resource extraction. He'd been writing about finance. And there were a bunch of changes in Saudi Arabia. For decades, Saudi Arabia had been a place that basically did everything the same way. It was this relatively insular country. It pumped oil, sold oil, tried to keep world oil markets stable, and was a reliable ally for the US and the UK. And nothing really changed. And all of a sudden, things started changing. There was obviously a new king, 2015, and his son, this prince who very few people outside the kingdom had heard of, Mohammed bin Salman, was out there talking about wholesale changes to the economy and doing an IPO of this state-owned oil company. And all of these things that were like just a huge departure from where Saudi Arabia had been. And so our editor at the time, who was in charge of the Wall Street Journal's resources coverage, realized that this was something that rather than just covering a day-to-day basis as we always had as an oil producer, we needed to kind of get deeper into Saudi Arabia and understand what was going on. So it was actually my editor's idea that Bradley and I start working on it, and it was a good idea.
No, that's great. I cannot imagine that researching for a book such as this was easy. We've seen how Saudi Arabia and MBS deal with critics, for example. I suspect people close to him in general would have been cautious to speak to Western journalists. How did you handle this problem? How did you get them to open up and speak about Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi Arabia in general in a country that's quite opaque and restricts freedom of speech?
Well, so what Bradley and I do and have done for our whole careers is we, at the most basic level, try to get inside complex institutions. And sometimes they're banks, sometimes they're companies, sometimes they're local government agencies in the US or government entities in other countries. And it's always sort of the same process, which is, nobody wants to talk to you. And at the institutional level, they want to hold information very closely. But you find the one or two or three people who are willing to share some information. And sometimes they're friends, sometimes they're people who don't like who's in power. You never know who it's going to be. And then once you start gathering some information and you go from being a total outside observer to someone who knows a little bit about how an organization works, it opens up, doors open up for you. And so, it was the same process as anything else, where you find one person here, one person there, and eventually you develop enough knowledge that people who are closer to the center of power feel like they have to talk to you. Otherwise, they might be missing out on something, or otherwise you might get it wrong in your newspaper story or book. There's definitely any institution with a strong leader, there's always fear of what happens if you're a leaker, or what happens if you're seen as a whistleblower or a critic. For us, Bradley and I felt that we personally didn't really have a risk. There's never been any, dangerous behavior toward American journalists by the Saudi government. And, we didn't feel personally we had any issues, but we were very careful about protecting the identity of our sources and making sure that, both in terms of like information security and also the way we published information we gathered, we were very clear that it was a priority from the beginning to keep anonymous sources anonymous and do whatever we had to protect who they were. But so it was a challenge, but it wasn't the type of it wasn't a challenge that was outlandishly different from what we normally do.
Yeah, which is why there's very few names in your book. You don't really cite anyone. But I think it reads better that way, and you get to protect your sources as well. But let's begin with the man himself, Mohammed bin Salman. As you mentioned, he was virtually unknown prior to 2015, when his father, King Salman, replaced his older brother, King Abdullah, to the throne. And within the space of 2 years, he amassed, lots of power. He consolidated power in an unprecedented way, and you can say it became the center of gravity for everything that happened within the kingdom. But in many ways, as you document in your book, his rise was somewhat a surprise given his youth, lack of seniority, and the fact that there was no. In fact, there was a palace coup actually following the death of King Abdullah to ensure that the line of succession went down the path of his family and not that of King Salman, his brother, who was the crown prince at the time. So tell us about the coup to prevent King Salman becoming King Salman, and MBS's role in making sure that the line of succession stayed in his side, in his family's side.
Yeah, I don't know if I would use the word coup. It's a little more.
Okay, palace coup, if you want to call it that.
There were factions within the family so the crown was supposed to go from Abdullah to the crown prince, who at the time of Abdullah's death was King Salman, Mohammed bin Salman's father, then Prince Salman. And there were factions within the royal family, within the royal court, that would have preferred the crown not go to Salman. For a couple of reasons. One of them is, Salman was always the family disciplinarian. He was a very powerful force within the royal family. He was the governor of Riyadh for 48 years and had built up a lot of internal political power through that position. He had I think a functional relationship with the religious establishment. And more importantly, he didn't have a lot of tolerance for corruption that he felt was out of line, and he didn't have a lot of patience for government officials who he felt were amassing too much power, who weren't members of the royal family. And so under King Abdullah, there were a number of figures who had, like the head of his royal court, for example, the guy who was sort of his head of protocol, people who were not members of the royal family, who developed a lot of power, and they developed decision-making power. And Salman did not like that. And these people for years knew that Salman was someone who, if he became king, they would be done. They could be wiped out financially, they could be put in prison. So there was that piece of it. There were also the sons of King Abdullah, who worried that, and this happens every time there's a change in succession. Saudi Arabia, the crown doesn't go from father to child. The crown went from the founder of the kingdom, in America they call him Ibn Saud, to his favorite son, and since then it's gone from brother to brother to brother to brother. And so when it goes from, when King Khalid is the king and he dies and the throne goes to his brother, all of Khalid's children go from being very powerful with huge access to wealth and to decision-making power in the government, to top-level government positions, to nobodies. And people who are no longer of consequence. They might be rich, but they're not of political consequence. They don't have power. And so I think Abdullah's sons saw not only that they would be made obsolete, they would no longer be the sons of the king. They would just be a bunch of, sons of a former king. They also, they had amassed huge wealth. and they knew that Salman looked down upon the way some of them made money, and and it's been well documented that one of the sons got very rich as head of the Ministry of Interior, and another one was involved in all sorts of business deals, including this 1MDB, this Malaysia scandal, and a lot of it kind of looked bad to outsiders, and Salman didn't like that. So they were afraid that not only would they lose power, but they could lose money. And so a couple of Abdullah's sons, I think tried to convince King Abdullah that now was the time for the crown to go down to the next generation, rather than go from brother to brother, that it should go down to the sons of Abdullah. And that was very hard. Abdullah didn't really budge on that. And the last minute, there was some maneuvering to try to get it. So even if it did go to Salman, that Mohammed bin Salman would not be in line to get the throne, because they knew that he was sort of the enforcer. He had been his father's enforcer, and he was the person who, like we were saying before, Saudi Arabia moved very slowly. Things didn't change, and they knew he was the one guy who liked change and acted in a forceful way and quickly and decisively. And so there was a move by some of Abdullah's courtiers and sons to try to make sure Muhammad wouldn't be in line. And the way Salman appeased them was by, he put his nephew, Mohammed bin Nayef, beneath him as crown prince. So that was the
succession.
That was the plan. Yeah.
I mean, one thing, a lot has been made of the fact that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, I will just call him MBS from now, he's never really studied abroad, and the fact that he remained within the kingdom throughout his childhood, unlike for example, his half-brothers, one of whom became, I think, one of the first Arab astronauts. Some of them have PhDs from Western universities. He more or less spent his entire life within the kingdom. You're right that this has been important to MBS's rise to power, especially in his ability to understand Saudi society, the machinations of power within the country, and also his ability to connect with Saudi youth who comprise 60% of the country's population. So speak a little bit about that. I mean, how he's managed to develop that. I think it's something that's quite underestimated when it comes to Mohammed bin Salman's rise to power.
I think you're right, and I think it's. I don't know if it's actually important as a matter of substance, but as a matter of perception, it's very important. Starting with his father, I think we mentioned in the book at one point many years ago at an event, someone was sitting next to a Western government official and told him, I didn't go to the Sorbonne to learn how to become a prince. And Salman, I think valued foreign relationships and values the things that one can learn abroad, but felt that in order to know how to run Saudi Arabia, you needed to understand Saudi Arabia and the way things were done, and the way the royal court works, the way the palaces work. And he had this earlier batch of sons that he said were very accomplished, who got these great educations abroad, but they weren't tough. They or at least they showed no capacity for toughness. They showed expertise. They showed drive to learn more. But at 15 or 16, around the time that a lot of the senior Saudi princes would go abroad for their education, Mohammed bin Salman stayed home. Two of his brothers died, right? Just one not long before, one not long after 9/11. Two of the older brothers, and I think Salman, Prince Salman, was really, distraught. It was a very difficult time for the family. Mohammed decided to stay home, and he didn't just stay home, but he stayed physically very close to his father. I mean, he would spend hours a day sitting with his father in the palace in Riyadh while his father was doing the business of governing. And so when a lot of young Saudi princes were abroad studying, in university, Mohammed bin Salman was at home literally watching his father govern and learning how one runs a royal court. And so, I think in Salman's eyes, that gave him a level of credibility that nobody else had as a potential successor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know really how Saudi youth see that. I don't know if I'm sure a lot of Saudi youth would want someone who had a more international outlook or had more international experience, and I'm sure some, like his Saudiness. I don't really know how that flies.
Yeah, I was wrong. His definitely seems to have appealed to the youth. I mean, that's we'll discuss that for a bit later. And what was interesting in the book, I mean, you mentioned in a discussion with or meeting with one of the leading scholars in Saudi Arabia, Salman al-Auda. I think he mentioned that his favorite philosopher was Machiavelli and the Prince. And I was wondering whether you read more into that. I mean, was he just trying to show off, or is he really kind of Machiavellian? Has he really developed the art of pursuing political power through means which normally you'd think is immoral or is not palatable with most people? I mean, what did you read into that? The fact that he thinks Machiavelli is his favorite philosopher, and he must have studied him at great length.
He was young when he said that. He's
okay.
In his 20s, and I think some of it looked to me a little bit like youthful posturing. Wanted to show that he was well read, wanted to show that he was educated, wanted to show the thing he read was something forceful. But I think it's hard to. I mean, if I'm a politician in Washington, D.C., to say I follow Machiavelli is a very different thing than being someone in a monarchy saying you follow Machiavelli. Like, when you're in a royal court, when you're in a monarchy, I mean, from what I understand, there's not really, a legitimate rules-based by the books process for how politics gets done. Like, the way it works in a royal court is, you have to fight with whatever means it takes to make sure that you're next in the line for succession. It's not like Saudi Arabia had some process for succession that Mohammed bin Salman hijacked. So I think, I thought it was an interesting anecdote just because, he was a young guy kind of, boasting this was the book he read to a Muslim cleric who, like him or dislike him, Salman al-Auda has devoted his life to religion, which is a very, different perspective than the Machiavellian one. But I think, I think to say that, as someone who is a member of a royal court participating in palace intrigue, to then criticize him for following Machiavelli rather than some other philosopher of palace intrigue seems a little, rich to me.
I mean, I did find it quite revealing, though. That anecdote you provided, it was quite humorous, and I found it quite.
Yeah, I thought so too. Yeah. I mean, yes, yeah. I thought it was revealing of who he was as a young man, and the fact that he was telling this to a cleric was revealing. I don't know that there's a different. Like, I don't know that you could become Mohammed bin Salman, meaning become the crown prince of Saudi Arabia as it is now, without following some of the most central aspects of what Machiavelli writes about.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, if nothing else, he is a disruptor. So I mean, if you look at the way he's managed to gather power, consolidate power, you'll see how he's undermined many of the institutions of Saudi Arabia. Despite its reputation as an absolute monarchy, the Saudi political system, as we know, has its own opaque form of checks and balances. Big decisions generally require consensus from senior princes, which is why change generally, as you mentioned, is slow and glacial. So the balance of power has also been maintained. You mentioned that in your book through the division of the armed forces into different ministerial posts who are run by different families. So how has he disrupted that? How has he kind of completely smashed this apart and taken all those different pillars of Saudi power and consolidated under his wing?
Okay, so I'll dial it back a bit to say that he to set the stage here, he has this challenge, which is, to the extent that there were institutions in Saudi Arabia, and that they were to the extent there were institutions, there were checks and balances. They weren't really functional. Like in a monarchy, in an absolute monarchy, institutional power is a threat. You don't want any institution to become too powerful. So there's never been an incentive for the royal family to support really strong institutions. That includes the military and every aspect of government. So Mohammed bin Salman knew that he's tasked in his role in 2015 with kind of reinventing the Saudi economy and being in charge of the Saudi military, he's tasked with trying to strengthen these fairly like disorganized, slow-moving, bureaucratic, ossified institutions where everyone is afraid to make a decision because they're afraid their boss might get angry at them, going all the way up to whichever prince is in charge of something. So he has a problem, which is how do you make these things functional and nimble and able to do their job in an efficient way, on the one hand. On the other hand, well, put it this way, the institutions are clearly broken. He needs to fix them. He doesn't really trust anyone else in his family to be in charge of them. He trusts himself. So he says, the only way to do this is for me to control everything, for me to take power over everything. And so that has the consequence of upsetting this balance that you had mentioned before. Now, it's not like when we think of a balance of power in the US, we think of the balance between the different branches of government, the executive branch, the president and the legislature and the courts, and they each have a role and they kind of keep each other in balance. The way that checks and balances worked in Saudi Arabia is that no single prince could become all powerful or, could amass all of the wealth, because he had a brother who was also very powerful and could amass some of the other wealth. So one was in charge of the military, one was in charge of the intelligence services. And so the different factions in the royal family were balanced out, but that doesn't necessarily create more stability in a meaningful way for the people of Saudi Arabia. It's not necessarily a good it doesn't seem like a good governance system to just have, governmental power dispersed between a bunch of brothers who just sort of like inherited their positions, don't really have any qualifications for it. So he didn't like inherit a good system. I don't know that putting everything under himself is the solution to that. But what did happen is that, so before you had the king, and whoever the king was would put various of his brothers in charge of different ministries. And so, for example, you had Prince Sultan, who was a very powerful prince who was controlling the Ministry of Defense, and Prince Naif, another brother, who controlling the Ministry of the Interior. And both had military capabilities. By having different princes in charge of each one, you prevented someone from consolidating all the military power. On the other hand, because there was a rivalry, the two didn't communicate. And so the Ministry of Interior was in charge of intelligence gathering. And they would gather intelligence and not tell the Ministry of Defense that could act on it. And those problems have persisted. Mohammed bin Salman kind of combined everything under his own rule. But these problems have persisted to the point where you had the Aramco attacks in 2019. And intelligence that came into the Ministry of Interior was not communicated to the Ministry of Defense, which controls the missiles that can intercept incoming projectiles. So part of the issue with Mohammed bin Salman is, he's done a lot to destabilize and to disrupt, but the system he was destabilizing and disrupting was not functional. And whatever new systems he's putting in place may not be any better, or maybe better. It remains to be seen.
Yeah, I guess, when you're faced with the possibility of a country running, facing a precipice economically, I guess something must be done, and that kind of disruption probably is necessary, but not the way he's done it. But I guess, I didn't see a chapter in your book on Trump and well, there is, but my question specifically was whether you think MBS's rise could have been possible without Trump or Trumpianism in general, without someone within Washington who always had his back. Would that have been possible, do you think, rise of MBS in the way it did in the 4 years, without having someone like Trump in office?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I wonder that myself. Trump certainly, MBS got much more out of Trump than Trump got out of MBS, if that makes sense. And I think, I think strategically there, and tactically, you've seen, Mohammed bin Salman has made mistakes here and there, but the way he saw something in the Trump administration, he saw a target, and the kind of target that he knew how to deal with. And we read about a little bit, like he spent most of his adult life dealing with old, rich men who were powerful, but never as powerful as they want to be. Old princes who would never become king, or who want to become king, or maybe were in line to become king, but knew they would die before they got the opportunity. So people with an ego and people with some power, but not as much as they want. And he knew how to flatter these guys. He knew how to get jobs done for them. And I think in Trump, he approached Trump the way he approached other people in his life. And I think it worked very well. He also identified in Jared Kushner someone who is roughly of his age, who could be sort of a kindred spirit, who saw himself as someone who wanted to reinvent the Middle East power structure and bring Israel together with the Gulf states. And so I think through his approach to the Trump administration, he got a lot of leeway from America that another administration wouldn't give him. When the Khashoggi thing happened, and with the Yemen war, I mean, it bought him a lot of open operating space from the U.S. and he might not otherwise have gotten. But even if the U.S. was pushing back on him or trying to rein him in or embarrassing him publicly, he's still the favored son of the king. And so I think it certainly helped, and I think it helped his image at home and in the region. I think it was important for MBS to show to other leaders that he's the guy who has the relationship with the White House. But I don't know that his rise would have been impossible without
that. Maybe not as swift, probably, or as cavalier, who knows. But I think it's a similar question, but with regards to the Arab Spring. I mean, I'm wondering whether you think, again, such a rise would have been possible without the Arab Spring. I mean, we don't want to lay every major development in the Middle East to the Arab Spring, but I think there is something to be said about that, with regards to Saudi Arabia. I mean, one could argue that, what he's doing is something of a revolution itself. He knows Saudi Arabia has, MBS knows Saudi Arabia has serious challenges, and to avoid an uprising of a disgruntled youth population, who, as I mentioned, make up something like 60% of the country's population. So he's come along and realized that to avoid a revolution which is uncontrollable, let's control a revolution from the royal family itself, and inject a sense of nationalism, and offer Saudis jobs, promise Saudis jobs at least, and make this massive change. So I'm wondering, do you think the Arab Spring had a role to play in his calculation, his thinking, and prevent future uprising of Arab youth? Is that something you considered?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And I think what the royal family has the shift that they are struggling with, and that he saw coming, is that for decades, as we're saying, the royal family, they pumped oil, they sold oil, and they spent the money on like stuff for the country. It was a very straightforward way of doing things, and they didn't want any change because they were aligned with this religious establishment that and Mohammed bin Salman talks about this, after the siege of the Grand Mosque in Mecca in 1979 by religious extremists, the royal family came to the opinion that if we don't let the religious extremists, or we should say the very conservative religious establishment, have what they want, their most fringe elements will rise up and create domestic terror. And we do not want that. So for decades, the Saudi royal family and the Saudi government didn't want to make basic economic and social changes for fear of upsetting the religious conservatives. And what Mohammed, and in addition to being afraid of violence, the royal family felt that their legitimacy in the eyes of the Saudi people came from the alliance with the religious establishment. So they felt they needed them as allies. After the Arab Spring, I think a lot of the older Saudi princes saw what could happen in a worst case scenario, and I think Mohammed bin Salman saw an alternative. And what he recognized, I think a lot of the older princes were like, oh, well, what can we do here? And what Mohammed bin Salman realized is there was this fundamental demographic shift where he said, over half the population is under 30 years old. The population's growing very quickly. There's Saudi Arabia is the world's highest rate of social media usage and the world's highest smartphone penetration in the world. So you've got a predominantly young population that's sitting there all day on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, watching their contemporaries in other countries go to hear live music, go on dates with members of the opposite sex, just gather within mixed gender groups at a cafe, go to the movies, like basic things, the basic things that we can do in the West, young people were not allowed to do, but were extremely aware of what they were not allowed to do. And he realized this is the majority of the population now, and the legitimacy in the eyes of the majority of the population for the royal family was no longer going to come from the religious establishment that was forcing everyone to just sit at home on their smartphones all day. Legitimacy was going to come by giving people more opportunity. And so this is, who knows if this is right? This is Mohammed bin Salman's approach. And so his approach has been, okay, we're going to try to tamp down the country's religious establishment. We're going to, make the religious police stay home. We're going to allow people to, go out with members of the opposite sex. We're going to create more opportunity for entrepreneurism, for tourism, for, just basic livability. And hopefully that will make people happier and make people support the royal family. And if they don't support us, we will throw them in jail. And so he both cracked down on dissent more harshly and created more opportunity. And the idea is, like you said, very much they've seen what the Arab Spring looks like, and they really, really don't want that to happen.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great observation. Just question of Khashoggi. I mean, I wonder how much that has been a setback. We know the political fallout, but you follow the money. So how much has the killing of Khashoggi impacted his modernization plan? We know, for example, Aramco was not listed in New York or London, but instead MBS opted for the more humble, Saudi Tadawul Stock Exchange. So is there any indication that, the killing of Khashoggi has really undermined, at least in the short term, what he wanted to do?
Well, I think Aramco is separate. I think it would have been very hard to IPO Aramco in the US or London under the terms they wanted anyway. But yeah, I think symbolically in the US and Europe especially, Khashoggi represents, like most Americans who know of Mohammed bin Salman probably know him because of that. Like, oh, he's the guy who killed the journalist. And it's obviously more complex and more nuanced than that. And he says he didn't kill him. And, there are all these complications, but that's sort of his brand in much of the world now. And it's made him a toxic person in the eyes of a lot of American companies. And so I think Aramco aside, his biggest challenge economically is getting foreign companies to invest money in Saudi Arabia. Still, most companies that want to do business with Saudi Arabia want Saudi Arabia's money. They want Saudi Arabia to invest in them. But what he really needs to move to fulfill his vision of moving the economy away from oil and just being a functional economy is foreign money coming into Saudi Arabia. And I think in the eyes of a lot of corporate leaders in America, they don't want to be seen as facilitating this guy who's known, known in connection with this brutal murder. So I think it's been really, really horrible for his image, and it's going to continue to be so. It's very hard to shake that. And to be fair, is what happened to Khashoggi is it anywhere near as bad as what's happened in Yemen? I mean, he's going to be criticized for violence. I think in the U.S. especially, a lot of people have been kind of don't really understand what's going on in Yemen. But Khashoggi has just become such a indelible stain on his reputation. I think it's very hard to shake that.
Yeah, which is, I want to end on this question, really, just looking at Biden's lack of response, shall we say. Having grandstanded during the pre-election talks, he said he was going to be harsh on Saudi Arabia and MBS, but he's not really taken any actions against MBS per se. And so I'm wondering whether you think, Washington really doesn't want to push too hard in Saudi Arabia. After all, it is an ally, and if it pushes too hard, it may end up in the China camp even more. And Vision 2030 is a modern day gold rush in a way, and eventually the Americans do want to have a piece of that and prevent Saudis floating towards China. So do you think Washington is still just waiting out, and later on it will be business as usual in the long term? Is that how it's going to be?
It's an interesting question. I think this administration is interesting when it comes to Saudi, because a lot of the people who are making decisions on foreign policy now were working for Biden on foreign policy stuff under Obama. And so they know, Anthony Blinken, we mentioned him in the book, like he met Mohammed bin Salman when nobody knew who Mohammed bin Salman was outside of a small group. Like they know who they're dealing with. They have, I think, a long-standing understanding of who these people are and what the dynamic is. And I think, from what I can gather, I think this administration has been pretty focused on trying to make sure that its actions are aligned with its desires. Meaning, it seemed like under the last administration, there were some foreign policy decisions that were made that seemed like made kind of on principle. And this is a bit more pragmatic and I'm not saying maybe the wrong principle, but these are our friends, these are our enemies, was sort of how the last administration was dealing with things. And what it looks like to me is that the current administration is much more focused on how do we get what we want in the region. If they think that sanctioning Mohammed bin Salman is how they're going to get what they want, then they'll do it. But it seems like what they want is a little bit of operating leeway to reinvigorate some kind of deal with Iran and get back to this Obama era approach of kind of creating a balance of power in the Middle East. And so it's hard to see how they get what they want by sanctioning MBS. And I say that because, first off, the U.S. realizes that this is a monarchy in which the monarch appoints his successor. And I think this government does not want to get involved in picking who the next monarch of Saudi Arabia is. A lot of people in the American security establishment really like Mohammed bin Nayef, the prior crown prince who Mohammed bin Salman pushed aside. They liked him because he was a friend of America for a long time. They also realized Mohammed bin Nayef was in very bad health and was was older and slower moving and may not have been a great king. And I think this administration appears to be taking the approach that they have no control over who the king of Saudi Arabia is going to be. So the most effective way they can do things is, sometimes you can exert power better by not taking the harshest step, but by holding the harshest step over someone's head to get them to do what you want. And I think you can also see what Mohammed bin Salman has done. I think very shrewdly. He kept a lot of dissidents in prison and a lot of high-profile people locked up through the Trump administration. And so now the Biden administration could pressure him, and he can do things like release Lujaina Hathlul, who's a woman driving activist. And so he now has concessions he can make to America, and America has that threat hanging over him. If the U.S. levels sanctions on him now, then it creates an incentive for MBS to be like, I'm just gonna do whatever I want now. It's not worth dealing with you anymore. And that makes it harder for the U.S. to get what it wants done in the region. So I think it's a pretty pragmatic, straightforward foreign policy approach of the kind we're more used to seeing, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, rather than the Trump approach, which was, Saudi Arabia and Israel are good guys, and Qatar and Turkey are bad guys, and Iran is the worst guy, and we're going to divide it into good guys and bad guys. It's just a more nuanced approach here.
Before we finish, is there anything you're working on now we should be looking forward to?
I don't know. I'm always working on something out there. There's always a bunch of stuff cooking, but hopefully it's worth looking forward to.
Okay, all right, Justin. Thanks for that. I advise everyone to read the book. It's an amazing, riveting read. I want to thank Justin for joining us, and thank you at home for joining us. And so very grateful. Thank you, Justin.
Thanks so much.
And see you later. See everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.